tuning in to WNHHLP 103.5 FM, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm Mubarakah Ibrahim, and this is Mornings with Mubarakah, where we talk about national issues from a local level through a lens of diversity. We're broadcasting live from to newhavenindependent.org. If you have to go away from your computer and you need to keep up with the show, then you can go to tuneinradio.com, or you can go to newhavenindependent.org and click that link and continue to listen throughout the show. So we are going to be here for about 45 minutes, and we are talking about something that is very impactful today. Today, my guest is Shafiq Abdusabor. Shafiq is a retired law enforcement officer. He served nearly 22 years on the New Haven Police Department in various roles, from officer to detective to sergeant to district manager. He is now retired. Thank you and welcome to the show, Shafiq.
Welcome to the show, even though you wasn't sure who I was.
I told people we're going to be serious today. So if you are just tuning in, or if you have never watched or listened to the show, Shafiq is my husband of nearly 26 years next week.
Next Wednesday.
And we act up sometime.
No, we don't.
But today we're serious. Okay, serious face.
Serious face.
Serious face. Because we're talking about a serious topic today. So, often we have these conversations at home. We have these conversations with our friends. And I think that it's an important conversation to actually have in a public space. Because, one, you have some very different, innovative ideas of solutions that we could possibly have as a community. And number two, this is your area of expertise.
That's correct.
So, Shafiq, tell me a little bit about you being a New Haven resident, born and raised, and then becoming a New Haven police officer. What was that intersection like for you? Let's start there.
So it was pretty different because, I grew up in New Haven, and I think I grew up in a way that people really don't grow up anymore. So, we lived in a projects for a period of time. Grandmother, and both my grandparents on both my mother's side and my stepfather's side were both from the Elm City projects, which seemed to be where everybody kind of moved in New Haven. And over a course of a lifetime, my mother, who somewhat faced what I think a lot of young people and young women in the city still face. My mother was a teenage mom. So my mother, I believe, she might have had me around 14 or 15. And at that time, you could not attend school if you were pregnant. So she had to actually be homeschooled because they didn't allow you to be inside of the public school while you were pregnant. So she went through that period of her own personal struggle with that. And then my grandmother took over and was raising me while my mother went back to high school, where she graduated on time. So she didn't miss any time. She didn't stay back. And then she got married when I was around 5 to my stepfather, who was in college for a period of time. And then he, from what I understand, he made the sacrifice because he was getting married and started working at the post office. So I actually had, a father in the home that worked. My grandfather worked. My grandmother was a stay-at-home mom. And I had a very strong mother with ambitions, and they eventually moved from projects to the co-op, from a co-op to a condo, from a condo to a house. So by the time I was 17, my parents actually by then had bought a house in Westville. It was around 1983. So there was no drugs. There was no gangs, no drugs. I call it black people before crack. It was black people before crack. So, and then I went to Helen Grant School, which was right next door to Florence Virtual Co-op. So literally my grammar school that ended at the fourth grade was right down the street on the same side of the street near where I live. So I didn't even really have to cross the street to go to school, which was like a great thing. And then my parents were working, so in the daytime I was considered like a latchkey kid. So in the fourth grade, I had a key that was around my neck, and then I would go home and, go in the house until make a sandwich until my parents got home. At the fourth grade, my mother was, she came to me and she said, where you want to go now? And back then in New Haven, there was troop school. There was, in the area that I lived, troop school and Baldwin school, because you can only go to the school, was like in a district to where you lived. So it was like troop and Baldwin, where the next, in Winchester was the next schools. Winchester's was in the project and was held to the no-no, was trying to go to Winchester. And it was a double held to the no-no, was trying to go to Baldwin. Baldwin was on Henry Street. Winchester, I believe, at the time was like on Ashman Street, and that near what we call the high rises. And I can't remember where Troop was, but wherever the hell it was, I wasn't trying to go. Because all of those schools, and then you literally have to fight every day in the New Haven public school. You were fighting, it was just bad. And I'm talking, I'm years ago, 34 years ago. And so I went to St. Aidan's.
Which was a Catholic school.
It's a Catholic school up in Fountain Street. Now, the interesting thing was there was a lot of kids, even in the projects, that were actually going to St. Martin's. And St. Martin's school was actually in the projects. It's where Yale has their substation. You go next door to that, where that field is. There's a park. That was actually a Catholic school.
Oh, where the park is.
Yeah, where the park is. And so there were what we would call project kids that actually were going to private Catholic schools at that time. My aunt was one of them. So my aunt was going to St. Martin's, and I had kind of got the idea of going to Catholic school from her because we were only like a year apart. But St. Martin's was about to close down. So all of the kids, most black kids, that were going to St. Martin's then started going to St. Aidan's. So we all found ourselves at St. Aidan's. And then after that, I went to Notre Dame, and then I went to, and so the list goes on and on. So due to the way my parents' ambitions and attitudes and I guess their work ethic, we kind of worked our way out of what would be poverty. We worked our way out of going from a super extra working class to kind of like at that time it was considered almost like an upper middle class. I mean, I was going to Notre Dame, I was paying tuition, I had a car. At 16 and a half, I had bought my own car. It wasn't a big car, but it was a regular car. And
is that history of being in New Haven, born in New Haven, raised in New Haven, did that play any role in you wanting to be or becoming a New Haven police officer?
No, absolutely not. To be honest with you, I didn't even like the police. I went down south. I was involved in civil rights with Joseph Lowry and Clara Scott King and many other civil rights leaders.
So during college, you went
during
down?
college, I was down there. I was I led one of the first apartheid protests in a Gulf College region. I went to University of West Georgia, and we had the first apartheid demonstration ever in that history of the Gulf.
Apartheid in South Africa.
Apartheid in South Africa. We were trying to get our school to divest from Coca-Cola and all the other things. So we did like a sit-in, built shanty towns. They called me in. At that time, I was the president of Black Student Alliance. Actually, I made president of Black Student Alliance my freshman year. And it was 8,000 students on campus. 800 were black. They told me that you were going to lose 300 blacks by the first freshman year. You'll be down to about 400 to 500 African Americans, and they crowned me the president of Black Student Alliance, which was a beyond extraordinary experience.
Because this activism, you brought it back to New Haven?
So I came back to New Haven, and I left New Haven in '85. When I left New Haven in '85, people was not selling crack, right? When I left New Haven in '85, if you want to buy weed, there was a weed man, and the weed man lived in a very obscure or shadowy. No one knew where people knew where the weed man was, but you didn't want to get seen going to the weed man's house, right? In fact, at that time we lived in on Winter Street in Florence Virtual, which is really nice. Florence Virtual is still a nice place, and it's a co-op. And the weed guy lived right next door to us, and my mother would be livid all the time because and this was when I was like in the 8th grade, because we would get the knock on our door and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm looking for so and so." She's like next door, but, but it was not at our house, so she would be livid about that. But nobody called the police about that. So
how did this contribute to your initially not liking the police and then becoming a police officer?
So it was like I left here, I went down to Georgia. I lived in a predominantly white country town that was about 30 miles. It was 30 miles west of Atlanta and 30 miles like northeast of Alabama near Tallapoosa. So I was in the middle of nowhere. I was in a place where when I would train in the evenings running cross country, and I would train in the evening, I would run down roads and I could see them burning crosses out in the field and having meetings. It was real. And I can't tell you how I could run so fast after running 5 miles, getting the hell out of them damn woods. But that was my environment, right? I lived in a town where everybody was nice, and even though you knew you were black and you knew they were white, and you knew what that meant, because all the black people live on one side of the track and all the white people live on the other side of the track. But I was a college student and I was from the North. It was just a different atmosphere. What I did find though is that the culture down there, whether people were white or they were black, they always came together on the common footing of everybody wanted, their privacy. Everybody wanted to believe in God, and everybody wanted their daughters to be happy, right? To be married to. So you would see a lot of situations where there would be a white girl, married to a black guy. A lot of interracial relationships, and then you would find out that the black guy was the football player that graduated, that worked at the school, and the daughter, and so forth. So you could see that where people came together on principle, not so much on race. But nevertheless, I was in the country. I was not in the city. And I was gone, and I had left. I would come home. I first left for college. I come home for 6 months, and then I came back, and then I came home for another 6 months.
Did you find that New Haven was changing?
It was changing.
Every time you would come home?
Extraordinarily changed. It was. And I left in '85. I left in August. I went to college a whole month early because I was on a scholarship. So I went down in August, and I didn't come back until December. And so at that time, my aunt was still living over in Foot Street. We call it, Southwest Drive, the projects. And I remember driving to visit her in the December. And I drove over there like around 11 o'clock at night. And it was just like people were walking around at 12 o'clock at night. It seemed like everybody was just walking around. Literally, I can tell you, it was like watching a scene off of Walking Dead, where people were just literally walking around. And I was like saying to myself, why are people out here this time of night? No one's never outside this late. You would see every now and then people sitting on their porch and stuff back in the day, but walking around, walking up to your car. And I never forget when I pulled my car in, a dude just aimlessly walked up to the car, looked into the window, and I was like, what the hell's going on? And then I went in the house.
And this was very different from the way that you grew up.
Yes. And what had happened was the crack epidemic had basically hit New Haven. And so, people had started smoking crack.
So would you say do you think that New Haven was a safer place when you was younger?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, we had, you grew up in New Haven. As a kid, we had normal kid life. You didn't have to worry about New Haven getting shot as a kid, as a young kid. I was telling our son the other day, when I grew up on hot summer days, you get up in the morning, you get dressed. We probably go down to the Dixwell Plaza, go to Florentino's, see what new candy they had, right? Or sometimes they had a pea shooter or a slingshot. So you get something like that, right? Some penny candy. Size up what the new popsicles they got because they would get the deliveries and stuff. And, you would go outside. Your parents would tell you, go outside, don't come back in the house until lunchtime or something. You try to bring your friend over and get them a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something like that. And we would spend 3-4 hours in the library. At the Stetson Library, reading books, drawing comics or something like that. That was our hangout. You got bored there, you go over to the Q House and you play some instruments with Mr. Bowie or something like, do some arts and crafts. Or your parents put you in the summer camp and you was in summer camp for however long the summer camp lasts, and that normally took you out to Wallingford, to the state parks out there. So growing up in New Haven as a young person, there were things to do. It was safe. There were and there was no drugs. So because there was no crack and cocaine selling and things like that, you didn't have to worry about like, oh, you can't go down that street because you might get shot, or you can't go down that street because the police might be chasing somebody, and all of these different things. What I did start learning later on, as I started getting like 15, and you start wanting to date girls and mess with girls, that things started getting really territorial. If you was going to get in a fight or get beat up, you were going to get beat up because you were in another neighborhood trying to talk to the girls, and the boys were territorial and saying, you can't talk to no girls in this neighborhood. But even that was not gun. Nobody was going to stab you because you're trying to talk with whoever, right? It would be like, yo, don't come over here. So, and people didn't carry guns, right? So I remember an incident, I think I might have been about maybe my sophomore year. So I was about 16. And I remember some of the guys from, New Orchard Street area. We were always from Florence, Orchard Street, Orchard, Hudson, in that area. And something happened and somebody was going to fight. And then the older boys who were 18, so I was like maybe 14, 15, and the older boys were like 18 and some were 19. There was a talk that, okay, well, we're going to go do something, but even the rest of us who were like 14, 15, 16, 17, and we was all around them, it was like probably like 20 of us, they broke away from us to go have that huddle conversation about what they were about to do. And somebody who was being extra nosy overheard somebody said, he going to get his father's gun. But we couldn't even verify it, and we was all friends like, oh, and the older guy was like, get out of here. And they literally abandoned us, and they went and did whatever. They didn't shoot nobody, I do know that. But my point was, even the 18-year-olds were like, everything was a big secret.
So one of the issues that we see, particularly in the low-income communities, in Black communities, and Hispanic communities, is we see when there is violence that the age range of committing that violence is getting younger. Would you, from an officer's point of view, would you agree with that? That's, I say, from a civilian's point of view, that's watching the news, that's reading the papers. That's kind of like what I see.
So you say for Black people or everybody?
For I think it's for everybody, but we're specifically talking about the Black community today.
In New Haven or everywhere?
Well, I really keep up with New Haven news. I can't say for everywhere.
So,
because it sounds like what you're saying is like when you're younger, you remember like the older kids almost trying to protect the younger kids from being involved in violence. And now today we have kids who are 15, 16, who's committing the violence.
Okay, so here's the deal. So the real
why do you think that shift happened?
So here's the real reality. The real reality is, and it's no longer a conspiracy, right? It was a conspiracy before. It's like, oh, Black people trying to be conspiratized and all stuff. No, the reality is we do know that based on the Contra wars and all the things that were going on with Oliver North and late President Reagan and so forth and so on, that yes, guns were brought into America. They were made beyond very available in the African American community, along with the influx of crack rock cocaine as a way to make money for the Contras and the Sandinistas to fight a war overseas in South America. That's a fact. So when I was growing up, that wasn't going on. Guns were not flowing into the African American community. You could not find a gun. If you were going to have a gun in America in a Black community, your grandfather had the gun because he was in a.
So let me be devil's advocate here. How does that? Why did the attitude? So do you think the availability of the guns change the perception?
So a whole lot of things change perception.
People.
So number one is you've got crack rock cocaine coming into a community that is where there's generational poverty, right? So don't forget the war on poverty was started, right? The war on poverty was really not about let's eradicate poverty and make people wealthy. The war on poverty was about we got to make sure that poor people where crime generates out of that poor community are kept contained and in check. So as Tupac said, they got a war on poverty so the police can bother me. And going back to the Detroit riots, as a result of the war on poverty, we also got shoot to kill order, which is still in place now from, I believe it was 1967, I believe.
What's the shoot to kill order?
The shoot to kill order gives the police the right to shoot and kill you, right? So that was instituted by Mayor Daley, and then that was later instituted as well.
So wait a minute, let me go back because that's going to get a lot of eyebrows raised. So the shoot to kill order for police officers, and tell me if I'm incorrect, is if a police officer pulls a gun and feels like he needs to fire, then he has permission to fire to kill, not to maim.
So the original shoot to kill order was instituted by Mayor Daley in Detroit during the Detroit riots of 1967. And what was happening was the police were reporting back that the rioters were burning things down and they were throwing bottles at the police. And what should the police do? The police were defenseless. So then at the time, the mayor said, you are to use force to shoot to kill. And the police said, we can't use force to shoot to kill because we don't have an order. So they developed a general order within the police department at that time that says, you are allowed to shoot to kill rioters who are looting and causing property destruction and or trying to injure the police. It did not delineate that they had to have a weapon. It did not delineate that they had to have a Molotov cocktail. It was a very broad-based order, but the order came out. They could shoot to kill under those circumstances. That was later adopted again in, I believe it was in Baltimore, Maryland, within the same year. And then therefore it became the standard as each individual police department across America began to adopt this general order of shoot to kill. This became the standard. So this standard is still in place. And it falls under the constitutional standard of that the Supreme Court uses of force, right? What is the difference between reasonable force and unreasonable force? We don't know because the Supreme Court will not identify what unreasonable force is. So everybody's still hung up on that. I've been in Washington attending meetings as of the last 2 years up in with Perth near the White House, and they still couldn't. The FOP, Fraternal Order of Police, Perth, the International Police Chief Association, they couldn't all agree on do they want the Supreme Court to identify what reasonable force is. No one wants to, because if you do, then what actually would have to do is you have to repeal the shoot to kill order, because why would you have a shoot to kill order that's put in place in 1967 for the purpose of riots and the purpose of, as it was said, to handle ghetto trouble, right? Why would you have that order in place in the late 60s and then it's 2018 and we're still using that same order? I mean, it has not, shoot to kill. And so here's my opinion. And some of it could be blended as fact. It could be perceived that police having existing shoot to kill orders has not decreased the level of violent crime in America. Because in fact, the shoot to kill orders under its very concept was put in place in the 1960s to deter people from destroying property, burning things down, looting, rioting, and causing injury to public safety officials. It was a deterrent. We now have extraordinary numbers of mass shootings at epidemic proportions in America. Did we modify our shoot to kill order for that? We didn't modify our shoot to kill order to say when you go inside of the school and you encounter a subject who has allegedly or appears to have shot 30 people, 20 people, 15 people, just shoot them. Don't negotiate with them. There's no order in there that says that. We're still negotiating with people who go into a movie theater and indiscriminately murder people, come outside holding a gun, smoking, duct tape with all kind of armor on and a hockey helmet looking like America's most creepiest guy, Jason, and the police are negotiating with that guy. But the police aren't negotiating with Castile when he's in the car with his alleged wife or his girlfriend and a child in the back, and he gets shot to death. Where's the negotiation? Where's the modification of the shoot to kill order around that? So it could be said that the concept or the idea or the framework of shoot to kill, in my opinion, definitely needs to be revisited. It doesn't even have to be revisited at a national level, because under the Federalist Papers, under Hamilton, which is Federalist Paper number 23 and number 26, which specifically outlines in the Constitution as an addendum how force is manipulated, orchestrated, and also how it is outlined based on each state and each municipality down to its own individual community. They have the power to determine how they want to go about protecting their citizens. So the state of Connecticut, technically, the governor could come in and say, I want to revisit how we use deadly force, because now they call it deadly force. How we use deadly force in Connecticut around law enforcement, I want to revisit that. And they could start out with, for the state of Connecticut could do it, the state of Texas could do it, and so forth and so on. But part of that's not going to happen. And part of it's not going to happen because President Nixon, on top of having a war on poverty to handle ghetto trouble, then instituted a war on drugs. And so now we got a war on poverty, still there. We got a war on drugs, still there. We have a
Which
war
happened under Reagan, right?
Right. And we have a war on terrorism, still there.
Under
so,
Bush.
So we've got 3 wars that are still in place. And what is very significant and I guess you would say is a continued theme that some would say is part of the systemic racism in America, is that all of these domestic wars that we carry out in America, there is always a brown person or a black person, a black and brown person, that is the object of the criminality. And so therefore, that replays itself in law enforcement training of, armed and dangerous black male. I mean, and we see it because the news plays into it too. If a white guy in Texas goes out and he shoots people in a mass shooting, they just say mass shooting, details to follow. The identification of the shooter is slow. The race of the shooter is slow. In fact, there's no mention of the race. It starts getting into, if there's a shooting in Texas, we're still trying to figure it out. Oh, this is a tragedy. Well, then they'll bring somebody on and start immediately talking about mental health before they have any of the details, and et cetera, et cetera. And the police are searching door to door, and they start breaking down how the police search and how technical it is and so forth. If it's Pookie, and Pookie done did a shooting, it's immediately Pookie. They try to find a picture. It's a black male. It's a black guy. He's dangerous. All the things are put out there. This is intolerable. This is horrific, et cetera, et cetera. So those concepts still play out in part, and I believe that part of those concepts play out because the war on poverty is about black people. So the war on drugs is about guns and drugs. And guns and drugs, you add in gangs, so it's gun, drugs, and gangs. Who's in gangs? Puerto Ricans, Hispanics, Latino. Who's in gangs? Black people. Who's doing these drugs? Black and brown, Hispanic, Latino people. So they become objectified around the concept of criminal justice, and we just wind up staying. I might have got off subject, but we just wind up staying on that. So
I just have to take a really quick station break and let people know that you've been listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM, New Haven's home for community radio, broadcasting live from downtown New Haven and live streaming on TuneIn Radio and newhavenindependent.org. You're listening to Mornings with Mubarakah, where we talk about national issues from a local level through a lens of diversity. And today we are talking about the impact of violence in the community with retired law enforcement officer Shafiq Abdusabor. So you gave us a lot of food for thought.
Yes.
So bring it to specifically within the black community. Let's talk about within the black community, and particularly here in New Haven. For me personally, I've lived in New Haven going on 26 years, moved here when I married you. And I personally kind of like remember the worst year for violence in our community was the year that Joanna got shot and another
2006.
And another little boy got shot. And it happened like within like a 2-week period.
Yeah, Justin Suggs.
Justin
Joanna Cole
Suggs.
got shot on, I believe it was the Friday before Father's Day in 2006, and Justice got shot, and I believe it was July 29th of 2006. I remember because I was.
And they were both young, under 15.
They were 13.
Both of them were 13. Both of them were 13.
They were 13 years old.
I think that shook the community.
Yeah.
And we began to kind of like analyze, like we've been off course for a while, but this was like it's time to course correct. It shocks the conscious,
right? So it shocks the conscious.
What are some of the ways that you think that impacted the community when, particularly that particular year?
So I think that what happens in the Black community, things happen differently in Black community than they do in the white community. When you see programs like the Cancer Foundation and the Leukemia Foundation and stuff, these are foundations often that's set up because somebody was directly affected and their family got together or somebody and they said, you know what, we're going to do this. Sometimes those famous people or people related to those causes die, they leave their money, and so it goes on and it builds and you have this thing going. Whereas in the African American community, obviously, where sometimes wealth is redirected very differently, because I think that sometimes we portray the Black community as being this poor, destitute community, where the Black community has a lot of money. It's just where Black people spend their money. Black people spend their money on a lot of perishable things, and use disposable income or buy things that would be used for disposable income using non-disposable income, if you will. I think the number is $30 trillion is what the African American community puts into the economy, the national economy. So Black people got money. So when we get these ideas and say, well, all the stuff happening in Black community because Black people is broke. No, Black people got money. You saw Black Panther 20 damn times, okay, at $17 a movie,
saw it 4 times.
Whatever, at $17 a movie, and you're throwing a popcorn and gas. It's a hell of a lot of movie. I just don't, and a lot of Black people saw Black Panther like 17 times, right? Mm-hmm. So we have money. So when incidents like that happen with with Joanna, particularly with Joanna, because she was our relative, at that time I had the program CT Rabat, and we were already dealing with. The program was already about gun violence prevention and working with young people. For me, it was that was a straw that broke the back for me. I was like, really? Like, it is time to really focus on this and push it. And so I pushed it, and I pushed it with the parents. And then, 2-3 weeks later, like you said, Justice was killed. And it was like, this is outrageous. This is unacceptable, right? And so, we started a whole piece with the, CT Rabat, but then we, out of that came.
So, but how does that impact? What impact did you see in the community itself? What the way everyday people kind of responded? Do you think that people were more willing to give up the person that
I don't even know
perpetrated the crime?
Right. So
did they come together in any way as a community?
No. Well, so here's the thing. So, people giving up people to the police really is about people trusting the police. It's about people, we call it the public trust. I think that's what during the Reagan era. When you had a whole bunch of stuff.
Public trust and police right now is like in the toilet.
In the Reagan era, they called it public trust, right? Is that you have to restore the public trust. So Black Lives Matters movement was all about the community coming together and saying the trust is broken, and what are we going to do to fix it? But before we can fix it, we want to make it completely clear of all of the components of how it's broken. Some say that you can measure how well the community trusts the police by seeing how many homicide or violent crime cases that the detective bureaus can clear within a year. Some say if that number is below a number of roughly around 35 to 49%, it is an indication that the public trust within your department is extraordinarily low. And so some people would then counter it and say, well, it's about snitching. You know, black people, they don't want to, they have this no snitching clause and so forth. And so there's reasons around that too. There's reasons around why someone doesn't want to tell that this person killed that person, because the way the process works, that person that gets arrested for killing that person could actually come out of jail before their trial and be back on the street and potentially re-victimize the community. So it's really a conversation about victimization and protection. There's currently nothing in the state of Connecticut.
So if you're afraid of being a victim and you don't trust that the police can protect you, then you're less likely to tell.
So I'll tell you a story about a young man that you know. I won't say his name, who's doing extraordinarily well now. When I met him, when I first started doing a youth program for gun violence prevention, he was 13. He was carrying guns. His father was a drug dealer. His father is currently serving time in prison, in a federal prison. He came from a single parent mother, and he was a 13-year-old hanging around with 17 and 18-year-olds, and he was the boss. He was the boss. And so I would spend a lot of time with him, bring him to the house, have him be around our 13-year-old, and he was really the one I put a lot of energy in. He now is a manager. He's running 2 franchise businesses, right? And he's about 27 years old now, right? Great kid. But I remember one day we were talking, and I was talking about this thing about snitching, and he was telling me about one night that night prior, some guys had rolled up on him and pulled a gun out on him. And I said, so, wow, man, I was concerned. At this time, I think he was about 15. And I said, so what are you going to do? He says, I'm going to let it go. I said, well, why don't you report it to the police? Obviously, I'm the police, but I wasn't on. So, it was different. He said, let me tell you something, Shafiq. He said, here's a problem. If I go to the police about this one guy number one, that pulled out a gun on me, once the police get involved, if he don't get arrested, even if he do get arrested, now his friends are going to be after me. I know who he is. I kind of know why he got a beef with me, even though I don't have a beef with him. I know because I know who he is, I know how to avoid him. But once I call the police and the police get involved, then I may have up to 20 people that I don't know that are after me. And I don't want to deal with that. So I'd rather just let it go. And that's just the reality of our community, is that how people think. It's like, I'd rather just get victimized one time than to be constantly re-victimized over my shoulder. I got to look behind my back and all these different things in a community where sometimes there's no law and there's no order, despite everything we try to do. So I, learned what I gather the information that I understand about our black community, not exclusively from books and roundtable discussions and pontificating and all the other things that go around with trying to appropriate the thoughts of black people by people who often are not black or who are black of a different economic bracket, and talk directly to the people at the time that are being affected to find out, has that changed? And this kid was 13, so he's now 27. So we're talking almost 10, 12, 14 years ago. Yeah, about 12, 14 years ago. With this kid, right? That ain't changed. It hasn't changed.
So what has to happen in the black community, though, for that to change? Because that don't sound like something that the police department can help with, that politicians can help with. That's right. It's something that has to change within the black community.
So about 3 years back, I was involved in some things in the state and in the city where we were trying to determine if we could force people to testify if they were a witness. If we believe you were a witness, we bring you in subpoena and you force you to testify. You can't force nobody to testify.
That's not, how you gonna do that?
And then that didn't work. And then you start looking inward. You start breaking down why. These things happen. Why? Because you have a significant breakdown within the African American family structure. And I've said this before. right? That how important active fathers are in the roles of black children. Now, when white people say it, black people get all offended in an uproar and all frustrated. But it is the reality. That's true. And I'm not suggesting that. Somebody jumped on me one time when I said that and said, Brother Shafiq, so you suggesting that black women are marginalized? No. My mama black. My mama one of the strongest black women I've ever met in my life, okay? But I could tell you, if my mother had not taken the time to get married when I was 5 so that I could have a father figure in the house, Shafiq sitting here would be a different Shafiq than you talking to right now. You need men in your life. Kids need men. Black boys need fathers. Whether that father's a white father in the house or a Puerto Rican father or a Chinese father, they need male stability within a family structure. If it's a surrogate grandfather, it needs to be somebody that's constant, because that, for boys, and people can go out there and study it, for boys, it sets boundaries. Boys need boundaries. Girls need boundaries too, but boys need different boundaries than what girls need. It's like the psychologists say, what was it say? They say girls will sit. No, they say girls will sit and they observe. Little girls, they sit and they observe you do something and then they attempt to do it. Boys, they just do it. They're like a puppy trying to get out of the fence. They just constantly trying to dig the hole. You cover that, put a brick over it. That's how boys are. So you need that stability. So now let's get real about it. So the other real part of it is anybody that's out there that's raised a teenage child, when they get to that age where you literally have to become their second skin. Where are you? What you doing? What you doing? Way back. What time you gonna be home? This and that. How do you do that when you're a single mom working 3 part-time jobs? That's a reality in New Haven. That's reality. There's a large population of people living in poverty in New Haven, and a lot of them are African American, Hispanic, and Latino. And a lot of them are single parent mothers who are out there busting their butt. They got a job at Walmart, then they got to leave Walmart, and then they've got to go to the wherever, a Dunkin' Donut job, and then you've got a school system where you got to be meeting the demands of the kid is in school, so you got to go to this school night and that school night and do all the different things, and you may have 2 children. Just having that teenager is significant, and then so just that in itself is taxing your time. Now add in the drama. Let's add in a baby daddy. Let's add in a broken relationship. Let's add in an incarcerated father. Let's add in maybe a divorced grandparent structure. Let's add in maybe you are the 3rd generation of teenage mom, right? Maybe your mom was a teenage mom and you're a teenage mom, and maybe now you got a daughter that's a teenage mom with potentially a 12-year-old child. That's reality. So all of these things happening, and people are saying, but what's that got to do with the violence? What it's got to do with the violence? It's got to do with the family structure. When I was grew up Christian, you went to church every Sunday. I remember being 12, 13, and 14. The only way you got out of going to church on Sunday, you had a headache. And you had to have a headache. You had to have a headache and a stomach ache. When I was young, your mother come on, we're going to go to church. Oh, what's the matter? I got a headache and a stomach ache. And then your parents would tell you, well, you ain't going outside. So that means you can't play in the neighborhood football game today. You can't go outside and play marbles. So you make an
excuse, you just got to stay in the house.
Right. So basically it breached your freedom for the day. Why was church important? Because church gives you a moral center again. It reminds you, right, of our duties beyond ourselves, our duties beyond our community, our duties beyond our family, our duty to God to do what's morally right. It gives you that level of guilt factor of, this is wrong. And, black people, the first command we know, right? Thou shalt not kill, right? We throw that one immediately and then steal, even though that may not be the order, right? But those are just the order for black people. So my point is, black families aren't in the church anymore. They're not. The churches are filled, if they're filled, with a lot of elderly black women, a lot of middle-aged black women. Their children are not in the church with them. That's a reality. Just like being Muslim and we go to the masjid, our masjid is not filled up with all of our young adults either, right? It's the couples, right? Married couples in middle age and older. This is just a reality of of where we are in terms of our participation in religion as black people.
So we are toward, unfortunately, we have to do this again because you got a lot to say.
Well, you're going to have to pay me because, look, I'm doing a lot of free stuff over here, man.
We have
I'm
about 2 more
retired now.
minutes of the show left. So what are some of the, leave the guests with 30 seconds of some of the things that we need to think about in order to bring some type of solution to
our gun violence?
Our gun violence in our
so
communities.
Let me just first say this, to the 2 children, the surviving children, the 11 and 6-year-old whose mother was tragically murdered in front of them, we send out our prayers. And I would send out a plea to the community that our community needs to come together and support these children. And we need to do it in terms of a declaration of force and truth and strength to really take a stance against domestic violence, this gun violence that is levied against women that has been on the rise in Connecticut for the past 3 years. It doesn't matter how few gun homicides that we have in our city. We could have 1 homicide a year. But when we have a community where a mother can be murdered in front of her children, her young children, when the most safest place in all of existence is to be in the company of your mother, and your mother is murdered, and unless we rely on the New Haven Independent or other news networks to keep this fresh in our face, this issue goes away. What does that say to the moral character of where we are as a community? And for Black people, it's saying like message to the Black man, stop blaming white people for our problems. Stop blaming white people for our issues. It's time to just, you Black, handle your business. We need infrastructure in our Black community. So I get it. Something happens, people want to run to City Hall, you run to the police department, we run to something, you run to a foundation, we're looking around to see who's going to come. Nobody coming to save us. If somebody was coming to save us, damn it, we'd be saved. Okay? Somebody was coming to save us, we wouldn't have Black Lives Matter. If somebody was coming to save us, we wouldn't have a situation where somebody's got to break the news that the banks are still doing discriminative lending on loans to Black people to marginalize us so that we can't live in regentrified communities because they want to regentrify them. So ain't nobody coming to save us. We're going to have to save ourselves. And that's going to begin, and I'm going to leave you with this one. In the Quran, God says that He will not change the condition of a people until they first change that which is in themselves. And the first thing that they need to do is change our hearts. And that's what we need to do. Good morning. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much. If you have been listening, I want to thank you for listening to Mornings with Mubarakah every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. here on WNHHLP 103.5. You can check the comments below this video to find out more information about the last story that Shafiq just mentioned. And I want to remind you, as I do every week, go about your week to be a voice and not an echo.